By the end of this decade, a majority of electric vehicles on the road will depend, directly or indirectly, on Chinese battery supply chains. Most power grids that adopt solar at scale will rely on Chinese-made inverters, and many developing nations building renewable infrastructure will wire themselves into Chinese technical standards. This isn't a prediction. It's already happening. The question isn't whether China will shape the future of energy, it's how we failed to notice it happening in real time. To understand the stakes, we need to go back. For most of the last century, energy power was about resources. It was defined by oil fields, shipping lanes, and pipelines. The old world order was shaped by groups like OPEC, which could restrict supply, raise prices, and force the global economy to react. But oil, at the end of the day, is a commodity. A barrel from Saudi Arabia burns the same as a barrel from Texas. The new energy order is fundamentally different. Power today is no longer defined by what you extract. It's defined by what you build. Modern energy systems are engineered ecosystems. Batteries, inverters, transformers, high voltage grids, and the software that manages them. These are not fungible goods. An EV battery isn't just fuel. It's a complex item that requires specific chemistries, ongoing servicing, and precise replacement parts. A renewable grid is not a passive network of wires. It is an actively managed digital system. If you control the supply chain for these components, you don't just influence energy prices, you shape the infrastructure itself. OPEC only had to turn a valve. The new power brokers write the code, build the hardware, and define the standards. And unlike oil, which can be sourced from multiple suppliers, clean energy systems tend to lock users into specific technological ecosystems. Once these systems are built, switching becomes slow, expensive, and politically painful. We are moving from an era of resource dependence to an era of technological dependence. That shift changes the rules of global power entirely. This is the real reason China is positioned to shape the future. It doesn't just manufacture clean energy, it builds, scales, and locks in the infrastructure and standards the rest of the world must operate on. So how did one country come to dominate this new system? China didn't stumble into this position by accident. After joining the World Trade Organization in 2001, China made a deliberate strategic choice. It would become the world's manufacturing backbone. In 2005, Beijing passed its renewable energy law, mandating that 15% of its primary energy consumption by 2020 come from non-fossil sources such as renewables or nuclear. But the critical move wasn't the target, it was the execution. China subsidized every layer of the supply chain required to meet it. By the early 2010s, while much of the West was still debating climate policy, China had already built a clean energy manufacturing ecosystem worth tens of billions of dollars. This wasn't driven by environmental idealism, it was driven by industrial strategy. China's advantage is not just financial, it's also structural. At the base of the supply chain, China dominates processing and refining. It handles the majority of global cobalt processing and maintains overwhelming control over rare earth refining, materials essential for batteries, wind turbines, and grid infrastructure. China doesn't just export raw materials, it manufactures battery cells, assembles packs, and integrates finished systems. Controlling every step creates efficiencies that are extremely difficult to replicate quickly. This is the power of learning curves. When production volumes are massive, small improvements compound relentlessly. Take solar manufacturing. In the early 2010s, Chinese panels were broadly comparable to Western alternatives, but China produced at a far greater scale. That meant more iterations, faster optimization, lower defect rates, and accelerating cost reductions. Over time, Chinese manufacturers didn't just become cheaper, they became better. In 2026, China is expected to account for roughly 80% of global solar manufacturing capacity, producing panels at prices Western firms struggle to match even with subsidies. While the US debates whether to permit a single battery gigafactory, China is building dozens. In 2025 alone, China installed roughly 200 gigawatts of new solar capacity, more than the entire cumulative installed base of some advanced economies. Western policies like the US Inflation Reduction Act and the EU Green Deal are attempts to respond, but they are reactive. They aim to build isolated facilities. China operates a fully integrated industrial machine. China's dominance is no longer emerging, it's already entrenched. This dependence is no longer theoretical, it's visible across global markets. In late 2025, imports of Chinese electric vehicles into Mexico surged dramatically, rising by more than 20-fold in a single month, albeit from a relatively small base. The reason was simple arithmetic. A Tesla Model 3 started at around $45,000. A Volkswagen ID.4 was over $40,000. But a BYD UN Plus from China started at under $20,000. Comparable range, comparable features, less than half the price. For a Mexican household earning roughly $25,000 a year, this wasn't a brand preference, it was the only viable option. And once that vehicle was purchased, the buyer was effectively locked into a Chinese supply chain for parts, servicing, software updates, and replacements. This wasn't a political decision by Mexico, it was a market outcome. Similar patterns are emerging in Brazil, Southeast Asia, and parts of Eastern Europe. And the dependence doesn't stop at developing economies. Global automakers are already adjusting production lines to comply with Chinese battery safety and certification standards set to take effect in 2026. Not because they want to, but because participation in the world's largest EV ecosystem increasingly requires it. At this point, excluding Chinese components doesn't just raise cost. For many projects, it halts deployment entirely. And here's the uncomfortable trade-off. China's scale has pushed clean energy prices down globally, accelerating adoption and lowering emissions, even as it concentrates industrial power. The global energy transition has reached a phase where speed and scale increasingly depend on Chinese supply chains. And economic dependence, once established, has consequences that extend far beyond price. Economic dependence becomes a strategic vulnerability when political tensions rise. Renewables were supposed to deliver energy independence. After all, no one owns the sun or the wind. But that logic ignores a critical reality. Owning the resource is meaningless if you don't own the machines that harvest it. You may control the sunlight over your territory, but if the inverters, transformers, and control systems come from abroad, independence is an illusion. Modern electricity grids are not passive systems. They are digital networks managed by software, power electronics, and specialized hardware. Relying on a strategic competitor to supply the nervous system of your national grid raises security concerns that policymakers are only beginning to confront. China now dominates processing across dozens of critical minerals essential to clean energy systems. That creates a growing mismatch between diplomatic alliances and supply chain realities. Consider a scenario where geopolitical tensions escalate later this decade, over Taiwan, trade disputes, or regional security. Beijing doesn't need to impose a full embargo. Temporary export restrictions or licensing delays would be enough to create pressure. The West could respond by accelerating domestic supply chains, but the timelines are unforgiving. New mines, refineries, and processing facilities take many years, often a decade or more, to reach full operation. During that gap, EV production slows, grid upgrades stall, strategic industries face shortages that cannot be quickly resolved. This isn't speculation, it's the arithmetic of infrastructure. Which raises an uncomfortable question. Are today's policy decisions being made with these timelines fully understood? So, what if the West tried to unwind this dependence? Reversing supply chain dominance is not as simple as writing checks or passing legislation. Even when funding exists, Western projects face years of permitting delays, local opposition, fragmented regulation, and legal challenges, frictions that dramatically slow scale up. Infrastructure creates lock-in. Once a grid is built around specific standards, voltage requirements, software protocols, and maintenance systems, switching becomes extraordinarily expensive. Battery factories can be built in a few years, but the upstream mines and chemical processing facilities they depend on often take a decade or longer. While the US and Europe navigate permitting and construction timelines, China continues to expand capacity. Scale creates standards, and standards create permanence. We've seen this dynamic before. In the 1990s, India built its telecom infrastructure around European standards. When Chinese equipment later became cheaper and more advanced, switching would have required retraining tens of thousands of technicians, replacing billions in infrastructure, and enduring years of disruption. India remained locked in. Today, their telecom grid still runs on European protocols. Now apply that same logic to energy grids. By the 2030s, utilities that have built systems around Chinese hardware, software, and standards will face an unpalatable choice: remain locked in or rebuild at enormous cost. Most will stay locked in, not because they want to, but because the alternative is worse. This is how dominance becomes durable, not through coercion, but through momentum. At the beginning, I said that much of the world's clean energy future is already being built on Chinese supply chains. You may have heard that as a prediction, but it's better understood as a description of present trends. The infrastructure that will define global power in the 21st century is being installed right now, quietly, incrementally, project by project. And the question isn't whether China will shape that system, it's whether we'll recognize the shift before it's effectively irreversible. To learn more about a Western country that made a fortune from oil, but is now struggling to find its place in the new technological world order, click on the video on the screen.